1966 with my father. It was the 50th anniversary of the Rising of 1916, and a great wave of patriotic sentiment swept the country. Here, they constructed a memorial which celebrated revolution, faith, and an idealized ancient world. At its center, this sculpture of the mythical children of Lir, condemned by an evil stepmother to wander the oceans as swans until the coming of Christianity sets them free. It was intended as a symbol of national resurrection, but also to say to my generation and those that followed that we belonged to an unbroken line stretching back into a glorious Celtic past. Our leaders stressed our difference to the departed British. The idea of an ancient people of one faith was central to our identity. The real Irish were Gaelic and Catholic. In the Ireland of the mid-1960s, I knew little of an outside world or of the Ulster Protestants with their British identity. They seemed to me an alien tribe, marching to what the poet Louis MacNeice called the voodoo of the orange drums. But a decade later, in the mid-1970s, the story of Ireland I was being taught had changed. School was no longer an echo chamber of the like-minded. In the shadow of the Northern Troubles, the old certainties would not do. We were being asked to imagine a more complex set of Irish identities. The idea of Irishness, of what it meant to be an Irishman, that you grew up with, that I grew up with, was pretty simple, wasn't it?
I suppose it was a standard version. It was a Republican tradition, and you didn't see outside that. We all marched to that song and to that drum, you know. It took a long time to change it.
When you came in here to teach people like me, did you have a sense, a feeling that you had to broaden our minds?
I suppose what I was trying to do was to show that there were other ways of looking at maybe the same thing. I always remember giving an essay, you know, Carson, Irish patriot.
The great unionist, loyalist leader in the North.
I left it at that. I remember one could say, "Sir, that doesn't make any sense." I said, "How do you mean it doesn't make any sense?" I said, Carson wanted the union of Ireland and Britain. He wanted for what him was the best thing for Ireland. Now, can you say that he's not a patriot because he doesn't agree with you? I was trying to do that kind of thing.
And telling the true history is key to that, isn't it?
It is. But you see, you come back then, what's truth?
Walking the streets of Cork now, I find a city proud of its links with the world beyond, and willing to acknowledge a history made of many influences in which Irishness embraced different allegiances. Our story of Ireland begins by going back through a landscape marked by the change of centuries, through the scattering of tribes, the rise and fall of kings, through prosperity and war, and a revolution of faith. The first waves of settlers are thought to have come from Europe about 10,000 years ago. This ancient burial site at Newgrange is the oldest known building in Ireland. Across the ancient world, men built monuments to their dead. But this structure at Newgrange predates some of the most famous. It was built 500 years before the pyramids of Giza, 1,000 years before Stonehenge. But what can it tell us about the lives of some of the earliest inhabitants of this island?
Well, people first came into Ireland about 8000 BC, after the end of the Ice Age. Farming comes into Ireland about 4000 BC, and Newgrange is built in the centuries just before 3000 BC.
Why would they build something like this? What were they trying to say?
I think for early farmers, the notion of ancestry, that's really the central focus of this world. The monuments themselves contain selected bones of the ancestors. This is the world of the dead, but it's capable of influencing the lives of the living, which of course is very much orientated around the farming cycle, the importance of the seasons. So of course you want to align your monuments in the critical points of the year, in the case of Newgrange, on sunrise at the winter solstice. Newgrange is part of a sort of international Atlantic phenomenon of passage tomb building, which takes us from Spain to southern Scandinavia.
So they were conscious of being part of a wider human race, not just stuck on this island.
Oh, very much so. Absolutely. And I think these early farmers building this monument would have realised and would have probably had stories about places that were far away, how things worked in other areas.
Neither archaeology or genetics can tell us the names of any of the tribes who settled in this early Ireland. But in the beautiful artefacts of the Bronze Age, we can see a culture shared with groups in Britain and Europe whom later historians would call the Celts. Tiny decorations. This lovely collar was worn for decorative reasons, one presumes. What does that tell you about the people who made it and about the times they lived in?
Beyond being just decorative, they are actually a way of identifying particular people in society, because no more than our own age, I'm not decked out in diamonds, and I'm hardly likely ever to be, but if I was at, that particular level of society, whether it's a question of wealth or position, then I would have needed a particular status in order to be entitled to wear these objects. And of course, if I was male, I might have been entitled to wear a
So we know that
lunula.
there's a hierarchy
Definitely.
by this stage.
Yes, there has to be. Yes, there definitely has to be a hierarchy.
You also have here something which fascinated me when I heard about it, because it comes from so far away, and that's amber.
Yes.
And you go all the way to the Baltic to find that.
Yes, amber really comes into its own in Ireland in the late Bronze Age. We're really lucky in this country because most of it has been buried in the peat bogs, and as a result it's extremely well preserved.
We've got some here.
Yes, this is part of a necklace.
How did it get here from the Baltic coast, from Poland or somewhere like that?
You're always asking difficult questions.
Well, that's my job. But
Yes.
this does at least tell us. Somebody comes from Northern Europe here with this material in quite considerable amounts.
Well, somebody may not have come. Somebody may have been handing it on, and it may have come through many different hands before it reaches Ireland. But what we do know is that a lot of it came, and a lot of it has been preserved because of this tendency to deposit these hoards in bogs.
There is a surface landscape which offers immediate clues to our past. And there is the Irish story concealed beneath our bogland. 1/6 of Ireland, more than any other European country, lies under bog, formed after early farmers began to clear the upland forest 2,500 years before Christ. This is a patch of bog in North Kerry that's been dug by my family for fuel for the fire for several generations. The poet Seamus Heaney described the men who worked the bogs as our pioneers, driving inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. And as today's farmers have dug deeper, they've found evidence of our earliest ancestors and links with a wider world. This is Cloney Cavan Man, a 2,000-year-old Irishman whose body was preserved by the unique chemistry of the bogs. Now, do we know anything about this man, who he was, where he came from?
Well, we know he was found in a bog on the Westmeath border. We know that he was killed ritually more than 2,000 years ago.
How was he killed?
He was struck first in the face, which broke his nose, and when he fell down, his head was split with an axe. His stomach was cut across. He was probably disemboweled as well.
Why would they have done that?
We think that this man was probably a king who was killed, and a number of means of execution were applied because the goddess to whom he was being sacrificed appears in a number of forms. So they have to sacrifice in all her forms. We can see he had this very unusual hairstyle. The front of the forehead was shaved, and then the rest of the hair was bundled up, a bit like a mohawk. And that was held in place with a hair gel, which was made using resin imported from the Pyrenees.
The very fact that you find resin from the Mediterranean in his hair suggests we were trading with that region.
Ireland's position as an island doesn't isolate it in ancient times. It makes it more accessible because travel by sea is much easier than travel over land.
Clonycavan Man gives us our first sight of an Irishman. And here in the National Museum, we see some of the finest examples of what we now consider Celtic art. But the idea of the Irish as racially Celtic, unlike the Anglo-Saxon English, belongs to the 19th century. For nationalists and their English enemies, much depended on belonging to an imagined finer race. So was Clonycavan Man a Celt?
He would have been Celtic in the sense that he would have spoken a Celtic language. He would have spoken an early form of the Gaelic language, the Irish language. And the art is associated with Celtic people on the continent. I don't think it means that we are racially descended from a Celtic nation. Genetically, this man doesn't have a lot to do with the Gauls of France or the Celts of Central Europe as described by the Greeks and the Romans.
So we Irish, let me just nail this one down because it's critical. We're no more racially Celtic